You are engaging in professional learning, which addresses the timely provision of early intervention services for early access, presented by the Iowa Department of Education, Early Access State Coordinator Dee Waddell. The target of this presentation is for early access leadership, early access service coordinators, and service providers. During this presentation, participants will be able to describe early access procedures for implementing and documenting the timely provision of early intervention services, understand the need to enter a service log to document the provision of early intervention services, adequately document delays in the provision of any early intervention service, and provide complete and accurate data for Iowa's Early Access Annual Performance Report of the timely provision of services, referred to as APR Indicator C1. The Iowa IDEA information website, referred to as I3, establishes procedures to implement the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, Part C, an early access administrative code for developing and implementing an IFSP, or an Individualized Family Service Plan. The content of an IFSP includes the requirements for the team, including the family, to select early intervention services which are designed to meet the developmental needs of the child and the needs of the family to assist in their child's development. In Iowa, early intervention services are provided by qualified personnel defined by the appropriate licensing bureau, division, or department. The early intervention services are provided in natural environments, which are settings that are typical for same-aged infants or toddlers without disabilities to the maximum extent appropriate, as determined by the IFSP team. Additionally, service coordination is the only early access service which is required by IDEA to be provided for every family in early access. During the IFSP meeting, the IFSP is developed by the IFSP team. The members of the IFSP team must discuss services which may be needed to meet the child's unique needs and enhance the family's capacity. The contents of the IFSP must be explained to parents so they are fully aware of and informed of all of the information relevant to their child and the IFSP. Parents must understand and agree to the activities on the IFSP, which includes child and family outcomes and early intervention services. Additionally, the early access procedural safeguards for parents of children ages birth to 3 provide parents the right to consent, decline, or withdraw their consent to any or all early intervention services. Thus, it is required to obtain written, signed consent for early access services from the parent prior to the initial provision of any early intervention service described on the IFSP. While parents may tell the service providers they want to start their early intervention services, it is required to obtain written signed consent prior to the initial provision of early intervention services. For example, at the conclusion of an IFSP meeting, the family may say they will sign the consent and return it to the service coordinator next week. Until the consent is received and documented in Achieve, an early access service provider may not provide the first service to the family and child. Go to I3 Procedures to learn more about the requirements of parent consent. In Achieve, the consent for early access services contains the components of an informed consent required when obtaining written parental consent. A parent acknowledges the child is eligible for early access services and the services described in the IFSP. They provide consent or decline any or all of the early intervention services listed on the IFSP and document their written consent by signing and dating the consent for early access services. Any early intervention service added to a subsequent IFSP must follow the same procedure required to obtain parents' written consent for early access services. The I3 procedures for early access provides information on the requirements of timely provision of early intervention services. In relationship to the timely provision of services following parental consent, the IFSP must be implemented as written and agreed upon by the IFSP team. Early access services are provided year-round. Thus, early intervention services must be initiated as soon as possible to meet the needs of the children and families. Again, the IFSP team obtains written signed consent for early access services. They then begin providing early intervention services described on the IFSP. While as soon as possible is not defined in the IDEA regulations, Iowa's system of early intervention has defined the timely provision of early intervention services as initiating the service or services within 30 calendar days from the consent for early access services. The 30 calendar day timeline applies to each of the early intervention services on the initial IFSP agreed upon by the parent's consent, as well as new services added to an IFSP during subsequent IFSP meetings. Timely provision of early intervention services is calculated from the date of the signed consent for early access services to the date of the first service log documenting when the first service was completed. The total number of days must be equal to or less than 30 calendar days. If the number of days is 31 or more days, then the service has not been provided in a timely manner. When communicating with families to schedule the first early intervention service, the team must use the family contact log section of Achieve to document reasonable efforts to provide the first service. The family contact logs include the contacts and details of the communication in the comments field. This documentation will provide information regarding the circumstances for scheduling the first early intervention service. If a service or services are not provided within 30 days, the family contact logs provide information regarding the reason for untimely provision of a service. Therefore, early access service providers must document attempts to schedule the first service and details such as the reason the first appointment is canceled or missed, or no response to a scheduled visits, weather delays, illnesses, as well as provider conflicts and reasons. The example provided here shows the family contact logs with 3 attempts to schedule the first home visit to provide an early intervention service. From the entries, 1 session was canceled due to weather, and 2 sessions were canceled due to family circumstances described in the comment section. The documentation provides a record of reasonable effort to provide the first early intervention service. When an early intervention service is provided, the details of a session are recorded using the service log in the Achieve system. The first section of the service log consists of documentation of the service provided during the visit to meet the child and family's needs. The information recorded in the service log is used as a part of data collection to calculate the timely provision of the first session for each early intervention session. Therefore, each service provider is required to add a new log entry to document the provision of an early intervention service. The service provider must generate a service log by clicking the Add New Log Entry in Achieve. This will open a service log where the service provider will complete at least the following fields. Ensure the session date is the date of the session. Please note, when a new log entry is opened, the session date automatically populates with the current date, so you may need to edit the date of the session. You add the service being provided, and you record the start and end time. After clicking Save, ensure all the information is entered correctly in the service log. When a session involves the first delivery of one or more services, it is not adequate for one service provider to enter one log entry for all of the services provided. This does not provide the documentation necessary to demonstrate the first delivery for each of the early intervention services. When the early intervention services are provided on the same date as the IFSP meeting, the IFSP team must ensure the IFSP is finalized. Parents are fully informed of the services on the IFSP and have signed the consent for early access services. Furthermore, the session log must clearly illustrate the service is provided after the IFSP team has concluded. In this example of a service log, the documentation shows the start time is after this time of the scheduled IFSP meeting, and a comment indicates the services are provided after the IFSP was completed and the parent had signed the consent. When an early intervention service is provided more than 30 calendar days after the consent for early access services, the Achieve system will automatically require the service provided to indicate the reason for delay in first delivery. As has been described, the Achieve system calculates the 30 calendar days based on the number of days from the date of the signed consent to the session date entered on the service entry log. Reasons for the delay in the first delivery must be documented on the service log entry, which are the family reason, agency reason, public health emergency that is issued as a governor's emergency proclamation, or other. Use other only if the circumstance for the delay is not defined in the reasons for family, agency, or public health. One of the reasons for other may be to document circumstances regarding weather. Additionally, the documentation in the family contact log section of Achieve, which was described previously, will provide the details of the efforts to schedule the first session and the circumstances causing the delay. Please refer to the resource Codes and Definitions Used in the Achieve System Early Intervention in the I3 Early Intervention Resources, which defines the delay reasons. Additional sections on the service log page in Achieve are used to document coaching components to support family or caregiver-child interactions and learning, which include the comments. This section of the service log may be used to record information the family shares, such as family events, upcoming appointments, and updates. Monitoring for progress. The Monitoring for Progress section in Achieve is structured to record qualitative and quantitative data on the progress towards achieving child and family outcomes and priorities. This section of the service log is used to record the family's reflections on how is the plan working. This information may be gathered throughout the visit with the families as they share concerns, challenges, and celebrations. Additionally, the providers document information and data on the progress towards achieving the child and family outcomes identified in the IFSP. FGRBI plan, or the Family Guided Routines-Based Intervention Plan. The FGRBI plan represents the Family 5Q, or the 5 questions used with the family or caregiver to identify learning priorities and embedded learning opportunities to practice during meaningful routines and activities throughout the day. The providers and families use the Family 5Q to determine what the family or caregiver wants to work on, who will do what during routines, how to organize the environment, how, when, and where strategies will be used, and how will the family or caregiver know the plan is working. The early access service providers can generate a family intervention plan as a summary of the conversations, interventions, and outcomes from the visit with the family and child. To bring it all together, the service log entry transforms into the family intervention plan. The family intervention plan includes many of the components of the service log. Additionally, once information is entered into the FGRBI section of the service log, which will auto-populate into the family intervention plan, the IFSP team will be able to share the plan with the families through the Achieve Family portal. However, the FGRBI section of the service log must have at least one of the 5 questions completed to generate and print the family intervention plan in Achieve. After the family intervention plan is opened using the print button, it becomes available on the Achieve documentation page under Documents heading in Achieve. For more information on using and generating the family intervention plan, please refer to the Achieve Early Access User Guide. As a component of Iowa's system of general supervision for early access annually analyzes and reports the results of the timely provision of early intervention services in the annual performance report, or again, the APR for indicator C1. This is what we refer to as a compliance indicator, which means 100% of infants and toddlers must receive early intervention services within 30 calendar days. Again, the data used to report compliance for this indicator is calculated from the date the consent for early access services is obtained to the date the first service log entry is entered into Achieve. Thus, if there is not a service log entered within 30 calendar days from the consent for early access services, the provision of the service is reported as untimely and not in compliance with requirements. Every service must provide an account for untimely provision of early intervention services. The reported reason for delay in first service is also reviewed and considered as a part of the reason for delay. While the agency must address circumstances in which services are untimely, family reasons for a delay are reported as exceptional circumstances. The child's family contact logs must include the details which report the reason for the delay. Other resources for completing the IFSP and provision of early intervention services are provided in the I3 Early Intervention Procedures, as well as early intervention practices linked on this slide. Please take some time to reflect on the information presented. Do a quick knowledge check by completing the self-assessment about early intervention services. Mark the following statements as true or false about the early intervention services. Early intervention services are designed to meet the developmental needs of children and needs of their families to assist in the development. Families have a right to consent and decline which of the services being proposed they receive. Early intervention services begin after families are informed and understand all the information on the IFSP. Early intervention services on the IFSP must begin as soon as possible after consent for early access is obtained. Since it is the beginning of summer, the first service will be provided when school starts in August. Now do a quick knowledge check by completing the self-assessment about timely provision of early intervention services. Choose the correct statement about timely provision of early intervention services. Timely provision of early intervention services. A, applies to only the early intervention service or services on an initial IFSP. B, enter a service login achieved to document providing a first service within 30 calendar days from the date obtained the consent for early access services. C, calculation is from the date of IFSP meeting to the first scheduled visit. Or D, all of the above. Pause for a knowledge check and then push play to continue. Check your learning about the early intervention services. And check your learning about timely provision of early intervention services. As you prepare to conclude this professional learning, please record 3 things you learned or recalled learning. 2 interesting ideas to share with others. And finally, 1 thing that surprised you. Thank you for the participation in the professional learning about early access and timely provision of early intervention services.